So recently, I've talked about Dharma talks and about koans, and a little bit about the way that, in a sense, every Dharma talk presents a koan, and in its way, every koan is a tiny, very compact Dharma talk. Talks a little too about how we might listen, might hear talks. And I think the thing I'd want to say about that really is to listen with the whole body. If we talk about presentation, embodiment, how do we listen with the body? Just by remaining aware, becoming more aware of the reactions within my body. Am I drifting off? Am I interested? Am I baffled? How does this actually show up in this body? Is that a nice thought or a nasty thought? It's a process of active listening, which is very different from simply trying to understand or any of the normal ways in which we listen. So in a sense, if a talk's like a gentle rain, it's also something which I respond actively to. A talk like tonight's talk, in a sense, and it's to do with the subject of it too, is perhaps more deliberately a little bit like a koan, a little bit messing with your mind. Questions. Not looking for clever answers. Not looking for definite answers. Maybe not looking for answers at all. But the experience of holding these questions. So let's start with something. Let's start with coffee. I fancy a cup of coffee. Maybe it's mid-morning or breakfast or whatever my ritual is. Or maybe I'm just out and about and I fancy a coffee. Now the question is, it's an important philosophical question. Do I want this coffee or do I need this coffee? And I'm not thinking in terms of ethics. Frankly, nobody ever needs a cup of coffee, but nothing to do with the ethics of the thing. See, philosophically, if I want a cup of coffee, that's to do with my free choice. I want a cup of coffee. But if I need a cup of coffee, well, that's influence from the outside, isn't it? My choice isn't actually free anymore. My free will is being compromised by whatever it is. And of course, that might be just because the caffeine levels in my blood are falling. It might be because habit asserts itself. I always have a cup of coffee around this time. It might be because my blood sugar's low and I know that a shot of caffeine at this point, So there's any number of reasons, but this is all stuff coming at me from outside. Maybe. That's a certain way of thinking about me. We can go to the other version of that, can't we? It's late at night. Actually, no, it's not. It's early in the morning. It's about 3 a.m, and I did have that cup of coffee quite late, and I want to be asleep, and I'm not asleep. And so I'm going to blame the cup of coffee. Or am I going to blame me for having the cup of coffee? Or am I going to blame the effects of the coffee on my metabolism? So am I holding this to me as a criticism, or am I pushing it away as this is outside. This is life crowding me. This is not what I want. This is resistance. And actually, while we're listening to this talk, a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of listening with the whole body is resistance. Where am I encountering resistance? Just this, oh, okay, feeling. But anyway, back to 3 a.m, just feeling, maybe I blame myself, maybe I don't, but this is still life crowding me. These are ways in which we kind of separate out a me from a world, and actually kind of me from my body, because if I'm responding to caffeine levels or blood sugar levels, or I'm just experiencing the restlessness that comes from having that late cup of coffee, my body is already being something separate. There's a me here, and then there's a body, but I'm not liking this. I'm feeling resistance to this kind of attitude. If you've been listening to these talks for a while, you'll know that at this point we sometimes get to René Descartes, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, but also the one that we can most cogently blame this kind of mind-body split on. For Descartes, on the one hand, there was the movement of the mind, my will, and then on the other hand, inert physical stuff, the matter of which the world, and for that matter, I am made. On the one hand, you get the will working towards an end, and then the rest of it is just its means, it's stuff I can manipulate, whether that's my body, whether that's the outside world. It's a really important split, and of course it created one of the great problems of philosophy, the mind and matter split. It creates a real problem because actually matter is obviously just subject to all these influences. I push it, it moves. I pick up the cup of coffee, it's in my hand. It's just inert. It's just stuff we manipulate, we play with, we push about. But then on the other hand, if my will, if my I in this sense, and if I'm identifying myself with this will, with this I, is purely mental, how do I ever connect up the two? How do I actually make this movement of mind into a movement of body so I can actually pick up the cup in the first place? That's a problem. Descartes wasn't unaware of that problem, obviously, but still made this very neat split. So effectively, although we don't really understand the mechanism, on the one hand there's me. Say, well, where? Actually, I don't actually know exactly where the pineal gland is. I think it's somewhere at the back, certainly on the midline. Descartes located the primary influence of the soul in the pineal gland. Because in a sense, I've got to be somewhere, haven't I? And this isn't necessarily a deep philosophical point, but it's just that kind of reflex. Well, where am I? Where am I in this? Okay, well, perhaps it's in this little gland at the back, which would be the seat of the soul. Wherever we locate, if we locate that or not, my body effectively becomes a kind of puppet, which is just dancing to my tune. My body is just another example of physical matter in the world. And if we have an effective method of communication, somehow from mind to matter, then I can make it dance. I can make it do whatever I can actually make it do. And in that sense, the body is clearly outside me. So where is this me? As I said, Descartes, it's got to be somewhere. Can we really have a totally non-located soul, spirit, will, sense of self? Don't know. I think we actually tend to have a remarkably similar response. Kind of instinctively. I don't think this is anything to do with, the nature of being human or anything. I think it's just our response partly is the heirs of Descartes and that whole rationalist tradition. The cranium, the brain. I think a lot of the time we're just, thinking of ourselves as this brain. And you can think of all those wonderful Victorian phrenological heads showing me where the faculty of this or the ability to do that is located. And we know that's guff. But there's a sense in which I think we're still, kind of thinking at that level. This clearly is me. This, sort of, not so much, depending on my relationship with it at this moment. In a sense, that also gives us exactly the same problem that Descartes had, because the mind-matter problem is now simply the kind of mind-brain problem. And, I don't tend to go near neurobiology, to be honest, much, because it gets complicated, it gets changed. But how far are we going to identify my mind with the brain? This, whatever this is, with what's in there. And again, I think that's something, which we accept when we're told, in effect, from all kinds of different quarters, that effectively the mind is the brain. I think, while we're thinking of it in those terms, okay, we kind of go with that. I think intuitively, when we understand that the brain actually extends right down here, that the brain is still part of the spinal cord, and that's what's happening there, that actually if we talk about neurons, there are millions and millions and millions of neurons in my gut, and there's in that sense the gut brain, which clearly has a lot to do with my emotions as well as my digestion and that kind of thing. And so if we imagine me as sat up here in some way in this brain, gathering information, giving orders, that's actually not really a very good model for what's going on. The brain itself and the brain function seems fairly distributed throughout this body, and that's before we've, got into the hormonal systems. Actually, my gut seems to have a lot to do with serotonin leakage or whatever. It's complicated. I don't pretend to understand it. But, we're talking about adrenaline, estrogen, testosterone, these hormones which form us and are so present in our sense of self and our actual behaviours according to their rising and falling levels constantly. Who I am at any given moment, how I appear, how I act, how I feel in myself is dependent upon all of these things. There's no simple me in that sense, no reference line, no 0 point. So where am I? This sense just of being me in all of this. Well, I think since, I suppose really, ancient Greece, Plato onwards, maybe before, there's this sense in which both philosophy and religion look to this idea of some sense of the free part of me, which is the rational part, the part that naturally and instinctively does God's will. What we can talk about objectivity, the view from nowhere. If I wasn't subject to all these outside influences, and we know, just this body is so complex, so much going on, framing who I am, the direction that I'm coming from, the mode in which I'm perceiving. Take out all of that. And then in Zen we have this wonderful, phrase, no self, mushin in Japanese. No self, which sounds exactly like this, doesn't it? The view from nowhere. That if only I could not have this sense of me, then maybe I'd be free of all these influences, all this stuff coming at me from the world through this body. Because if I didn't have this body, I wouldn't get tired, I wouldn't get hungry, I wouldn't find the neighbours annoying. It would all be, well, what on earth would it be? What would be left of me without this body? We've, in ordinary mind, and this is particularly, I think, one of Barry's key senses, we talk about vulnerability, as in this sense being the key. As sentient beings, we all share our vulnerability. In that sense, this is a kind of me that we all share, but uniquely. Maybe this is a different way into this sense of me. And a few weeks ago we looked at Barry's, we'll call it a meditation little piece, I am my body. Absolutely, bang on, I am my body, and I can sit there and I can chant it, and during Zazen I can really be this body, and that's great. But when this body is in pain, when this body is suffering, when this body is this cancer, this disability, this chronic illness, this whatever, can I still be I am my body? Gets harder. And when I say my body, it's kind of another dimension again to this, because actually what am I including there? If we're talking about the gut brain, well, are we including the 1,000 species and the, I think, 100 trillion gut bacteria in me, which form an essential part of me? Lose those, stuffed. Am I including the viral DNA in my cells? If I say, oh yes, I am this DNA profile, am I including the viral DNA? Am I including the mitochondrial DNA and the organelles and, all these bits of me which perform vital functions, still within my cell, but, human and not human at the same time? Am I including then all the, bacteria in my mouth, the bacteria that cover my skin, the mites that have, parasitic or mutually beneficial relationships with me, or these billions and billions of creatures that are me? And that's before I come back and think about these, somewhat autonomous systems within me. The heart trying to regulate itself, kidneys, liver, all these organ systems. And then the brain, which itself is not one thing, but many things. And if we've, somewhat put down the kind of triune brain, this kind of reptile brain, mammal brain, higher brain business, clearly different systems within the brain work in very different ways. There is no There is no single governor. There is no single self. There is community. Physical community, mental community. All this coming together as this body. So where do I draw the line? I think probably agree I am not the pineal gland, but am I this? Am I this? Am I everything that has the stamp of me? Or am I just this mess of stuff? But still with this sense of me that's, in its way quite definite. Am I in any way separate? Well, with Zen we'll suggest not. Am I in any way permanent? Zen will suggest not, but at any given moment, where am I drawing the line? Not so much in my head, but in my experience, in my actions, in how I'm living my life. That's a bit of a koan.